I think we'll get started here. Again, thank you all for coming. As folks are entering the room, my name is Chris Lewis. I'm President and CEO at Public Knowledge, and want to welcome you all to another in our series of webinars, online webinars. This one on the topic of more powerful than ever, do we need a regulator for digital platforms? And we're glad you're all here with us. And we're especially happy to have an expert panel to help us discuss this topic today. Digital platforms are today's marketplace, public square, and they're extremely important for a lot of the things we love about the internet, like free expression and the ability to organize and to dissent. And they are increasingly touching every part of our lives these days, but they're also some companies that are growing more and more powerful. And so we want to discuss that today with our wonderful panel of experts and see if our ideas for what we need in a digital regulator are the right ideas. So with me today, I want to introduce our expert panel. We're very glad to have, first of all, my colleague and friend from Public Knowledge, Harold Feld, who is our Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge and author of our piece, The Case for the Digital Platform Act, which makes the case for a digital regulator. But with us, we also have guests outside of Public Knowledge, including Susan Ness, who is a distinguished fellow at the Annenberg Annenberg Center for Public Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. And we also have Deji Olukutan from Sonos. He's legal counsel at Sonos, a consumer electronic product company. And then as well as our friend Adam Connor, who is Vice President for Technology Policy at the Center for American Progress. So thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you helping us out today. And let's jump right into it with a question here. And for folks who are watching, we hope you will write your own questions as we discuss into the Q&A chat. And we'll look there for questions from the audience and try to get to them as we get towards the end of the hour. But for this group, I wanted to start with just some basic questions about the topic of a digital regulator. Harold, maybe you can start us off with, why do you think we need a digital regulator?
Thanks. I think that what's important here are several factors. First, we've come to something of a consensus or a convergence of multiple opinions that this really is a distinct piece of the economy. It's not just business taking place over the internet. When you look at certain companies that are depend on economies of scale, that rely very heavily on the collection and use of personal information as part of their business model, that allow for a multi-sided market structure where the participants can organize in a number of different ways that give very powerful network effects, creating an environment where you see tipping effects. When companies reach a certain point, they just capture the flag, if you will, and start to become dominant in a way that is increasingly impossible to displace. But critically, it's not just about competition. And that's one of the most important things. When we look at comprehensive sector regulators, one of their important roles is the expertise and understanding that they have of their critical and complicated section of the economy, and how the decisions often involve trade-offs or require promotion of multiple goals. We've seen, in the last 2 weeks through President Trump's efforts, how vitally important these platforms can be for free speech and political information, and how these can be misused. We have seen through what's gone on with the shift to online shopping through because of the COVID lockdown, how e-marketing can be is increasingly important. And in all of these cases, what we are looking at is not just a question of how do I create more competition for Facebook, or how do I create another search engine like Google so that there's some competition, because that won't address all of the very serious economic issues, but also consumer protection issues, public safety issues, all of these things that come into play increasingly on these platforms.
Okay. Now, Susan, you have experience with being a regulator. Maybe you can tell us what issues you've looked at and why we might need a regulator for digital platforms.
Thank you, Chris. On Tuesday, a group that I co-chair, the Transatlantic Working Group, which is based out of the Annenberg Public Policy Center, released its final report. It was convened, basically it's transatlantic. 50% of the members are from Europe, 50% of the members from North America. And it was convened to promote best practices for curbing hate speech, violent extremism, and viral deception while protecting free speech. So it comes at it from a free speech perspective. We wanted to move away from some of the laws that have been passed in Europe, including NetzDG in Germany, French law that was just today, just this morning, overturned by the French Constitutional Court. So I'm excited about that. And rather to work to encourage coordination across the Atlantic. As we'll talk about later, Europe, England, are very much involved in writing legislation right now, or constructing legislation that will impact all of us because of really no digital borders.
Adam, are there anything we're leaving out about why we might need a digital regulator? Anything you want to add?
I think there's a lot, and I'm really excited to get into it. I think the two things that really jump out at me as somebody who, in my time in the tech sector, worked on a lot of different aspects of platforms. So content moderation, I have submitted an app to the App Store, for instance, and gone through that process. I think the complexity of the platforms. It is essentially, I think, a new area of law essentially written by these companies that's deeply complex. And I think the challenge of having to constantly explain that to regulators and legislators to get them to have a baseline understanding before you can even explain the potential abuses or the problems or the trade-offs that I think Harold has done a great job of articulating. I mean, I think it's a strong case for expertise. And I think that expertise, is something that is important and kind of critical in order to have that baseline to make decisions or make regulations. And so I think that alone is one strong argument increasingly as we see how we are settling in it. I think the other thing is, some of the timeline we might have thought we would have had for some of these issues, is really getting accelerated and compressed by the COVID-19 crisis. And so as we see the transition from brick and mortar to increasing more online shopping, as we see grocery stores being forced to rely on delivery, as we see restaurants as well, the disintermediation on the platforms, this issue, which would have taken maybe years to do, is really getting compressed. And I think that also means our attention to it and the ways to kind of get our arms around it, whether that's through preventive regulations or responsive kind of other pieces, is more important than ever. So I think I'm excited to dig in, but I really want to highlight that these are super complex. And so having that baseline level of knowledge almost seems like a predicate to be able to make any sort of policy making.
Thank you, Adam. And Deji, you represent a player in the industry. Tell us a bit about Sonos and tell us why Sonos, a company like Sonos, might want an expert, as Adam pointed to, an expert regulator.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting us to join this conversation, Chris. So I wanted to start by just introducing folks to Sonos for people who aren't familiar. We were founded in 2002 in Santa Barbara, California, so not in Silicon Valley, at a time when there wasn't streaming audio, there was no iTunes Store or iPhone. If you had a hi-fi stereo system, you had wires all over the place. And we had to invent the technology to make wireless audio possible. Next slide, please. So we created a technology category. We now own a patent portfolio of 600 or more patents. Many of these are patent families, which just shows they're very fundamental to these technologies. And independent authority or sources have looked at our portfolio and ranked it one of the highest among technology companies in the US. Next slide, please. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Sonos, we make speakers, we make components of speakers. We really want our speakers to sound great. I should say, sorry, not components of speakers, audio components for your stereo system. And we offer freedom of choice. So if you like to listen to vinyl records, you can listen to vinyl records. If you want to listen to streaming services, we offer over 100 of them, including services like Spotify and Tidal. And then it all works together. So 40% of our customers that buy a Sonos product will go on to buy another one. And we're in about 10 million homes around the world. So this issue feels very close to our hearts because we've been impacted by the dominant platforms, specifically Google and Amazon. And we found that these platforms use their power in one market to conquer adjacent markets. Especially markets like ours that could present a challenge to their dominance. And they use smart speakers very differently than we do. They use it to collect consumer data, which they can monetize according to their business models. Another thing is that they flood the market with price subsidized products, which we believe is based on our intellectual property, and then give them away at steep discounts or even for free. And that includes something that's often overlooked, which is software development kits. So sort of making it possible for other people to infringe on our innovation. We don't think that's innovation, and we think it decreases our ability to invest in consumer-driven innovation. And just one other thing for a company like Sonos working in 2020 is that these are essential business partners with a huge amount of power. To Harold's point, they're different. We are dependent on Google for ads, cloud services, productivity suite, on Amazon for retail and cloud services. And COVID-19 has only underscored these points, as Harold mentioned. And that means when we're negotiating, we're often in a sort of take it or leave it proposition because of the market power. So just, in terms of regulators specifically, we've been approached by different regulators, and if you've been following what's going on, there's several agencies that are looking at these companies: the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the state attorneys general, the Hill Antitrust Subcommittee. And we found the folks who work at these agencies to be really, really competent, very committed to innovation and competition. And we also filed suit against Google in January at the International Trade Commission and in federal court. And we're confident in the merits of our case. But sometimes it feels, as we engage in these conversations, that everyone seems to agree that something wrong is happening, that competition has been harmed, that there are clear examples of innovation that have been suppressed because of behavior of dominant platforms, but they're trying to conform it to an obscure legal theory or precedent. And then there's jurisdictional questions where they're trying to figure out who has the right to deal with this. Just in terms of the courts, again, we're confident in our case, but some of you have heard about this, theory of efficient infringement, which is that dominant platforms often have very deep litigation war chests, and they're happy to, go to court and drag out conversations around intellectual property and other issues. And by the time it's resolved, they've moved on to the next technology. So, to Adam's point, we certainly think, I think we're more focused on what does that regulator bring to the table. We're more focused on equity, making sure that the result is fair and good for competition and innovation. And, that expertise and intensity of focus, making sure that if there is a new regulator, that they have adequate funding, that it's sustainable, and that they, one of the thorny challenges is how do you keep that expertise up in our business, things move very quickly. These companies pride themselves on moving fast and breaking things. So the technology of today is, there'll be a new one, and that will be flooded with all kinds of marketing and all the tactics that are used to get people to adopt new tech. So that's a real issue, and I think we're just more focused on how do we make sure that innovation is promoted, competition is protected, and less worried about the jurisdictional questions.
Well, thank you, Deji. And you mentioned a lot of different places. You guys have a suit at the ITC, which we've agreed to disagree on, but certainly, I think we agree that there's concern about the dominant platforms and how they can impact adjacent marketplaces, like you said. So, Harold, as our kind of legal expert here, there's a lot of conversations about market power these days and using antitrust law. Can you explain why you think antitrust law and policy is not sufficient, and that we need an actual regulator with rulemaking authority? And Harold, I think you're muted.
I was, yes.
There you go.
Thanks. There are a number of important points here. The first, as antitrust scholars have pointed out, there are severe limits to antitrust. Now, some of that is court-made doctrine that a number of folks have argued the courts have, gotten it wrong and we should reverse it. But then, of course, you're talking about a project to repair antitrust law before you can even get the ball rolling. But there's also a way in which we're asking too much of antitrust here. Antitrust does not actively seek to promote competition, which is one of the goals that we would want to see here at this point. Antitrust tries to preserve existing competition, and when there is a monopolization case, it will, you can sometimes get to a breakup, but that's years and highly complicated. And then you get what I call the starfish problem, which is if you tear off the arms from a starfish, you don't kill the starfish just grows back new arms. There are reasons based on the way this market functions why you see constantly these concentrations of power, so that you end up with one dominant search engine, one dominant online purchasing platform, one dominant whatever we want to say Facebook is. In order to keep the pieces from coming back together and keep the starfish from regrowing the arms, you need consistent regulatory oversight that has the capability to take affirmative action to promote competition. And finally, antitrust doesn't concern itself with the importance of other types of harms. Susan, coming from the FCC, knows that one of the important roles of the FCC is to promote diversity of views. That this is critical to our ability to, govern ourselves, and the success of democracy is to prevent information gatekeepers or the manipulation of information in ways that people can't detect. That's not a traditional concern. There are certainly
Okay, thank you, Harold. So let's talk a bit about what we think a digital regulator could or should do. What should their responsibilities and their goals be? And maybe, Susan, we can start with you, since you've just completed this process with the Transatlantic Working Group looking at content moderation. What did you guys find that you'd like to see?
We take a bit of a different perspective. However, we intentionally did not look at antitrust or competition. We did not look at intellectual property, nor did we look at privacy. All of those regimes exist abundantly on both sides of the Atlantic. What we focused on was the growing emphasis on trying to address harmful content and our concern with respect to freedom of expression. and human rights and what that meant. So after a year, our group basically had legislators, government officials, tech company execs, civil society leaders, and academics. And after a year of review, we published 15 papers, all of which are on our website, and a final report, which we issued this week, in which we basically recommended a flexible regulatory framework based upon mandating transparency with accountability and a redress system for promptly dealing with complaints. Our basic pillars were regulation on the basis of transparency. The rationale behind that is it enables governments to develop evidence-based policies for tech company oversight. It pushes firms to examine problems that they might not want to otherwise address, and it empowers citizens. And the baseline framework would be legislatively mandated. We have an accountability regime to hold platforms to their promises. That is, what is in their terms of service. It would include an oversight authority, and that could be a government regulator, or it could be an industry association established for that purpose, like FINRA in the financial services area. And it would set the rules, audit performance, require and monitor redress mechanisms, and sanction repeat failures. We proposed a 3-tier disclosure regime, one for the public to basically provide them with the tools for which to make determinations. For vetted researchers, obviously much more detailed there, and for oversight bodies to help develop evidence-based policies. Researchers today are often stymied because terms of service preclude them from either looking at information or from publishing it. Effective redress mechanisms, where there we proposed 2 areas for further development and we're excited about. One would be an online e-court system similar to the small claims courts. It would be part of a judiciary, and it would adjudicate online cases involving legality of content and potential human rights violations. It would provide swift resolution with specially trained magistrates for the reasons Harold talked about. You need to have people who understand the underlying information. And it would create a public record for these decisions. And then finally, social media councils, we think could play a very good role. These would be independent external oversight bodies that would bring together multiple platforms, not a single platform, with various stakeholders to reach common definitions of challenges, to collaborate on rules, and to examine the impact of social media company actions and government regulation on public conversation. So those were some of the areas that we initially felt would be helpful. As a former regulator, Chris, going back to your first question, sorry, it was abundantly clear to me that the unintended consequences oftentimes from regulation were more difficult to resolve. That the legislation that was the basis of the 1996 Telecom Act, which we oversaw implementation of, we had 80 rulemakings under that. But most of the fights that went on were fights that had existed between cable and telcos that had gone on for 10 years. And so it was all looking backward, not forward. So what we were looking to do with this group is come up with forward-looking proposals that would help to reestablish greater trust in the marketplace between government platforms and the public, based on knowledge, based on transparency, to be able to move forward and address the problems coming down the pike, not just looking backwards.
Thank you, Susan. And we'll be sure to include in our follow-up email that we send to folks who tune in links to the work. Since you guys just came out with these findings, we want folks to read about them, and also if you've got questions about all that Susan was just describing, remember that you can put questions into the Q&A chat, and we can ask them of our panelists here. So that or other topics, please feel free to put those in. We will get to those soon. But so content moderation, one area where a digital regulator could have responsibilities, and we've got great work from Susan and her transatlantic working group. Adam, maybe I turn to you. What other areas would you like to see a regulator have responsibilities?
I think Harold's done a great job. And I think one of the things that I love about Harold's book is that he kind of tackles the question at the core, which is that in addition to the promotion of competition, in addition to looking at the expertise, that a lot of the questions around content are kind of inseparable long-term from the kind of broader questions of expertise and regulation. So I think, I think a tip of the hat to Harold for that. I think the challenge is not so much what we want the potential regulator to do. I think the challenge in this kind of hybrid environment of offline and online and of digital is where that you can kind of start to draw some definitional lines. And so I think in many ways, honestly, content online, that Susan and her group work is like maybe one of the easier things to draw kind of a circle around. Obviously, it has its own attendant legal consequences with 230 and other things. But, I think the question on competition, on digital platforms, on definitions there, on the kind of offline, online, that's the real challenge. And I think the question is, how do you draw that circle wide enough to encompass what I think the dominant platforms and the challenges we see today and we expect to see relatively soon, without necessarily drawing so wide a circle, So I think if one of the challenges, I think with, say, the FTC's mandate is that all of trade, all of kind of commerce is like a big bucket, then what does it mean to kind of scope and narrow it down? And so I think as we think about this, or as I think about this, that is, I think, the attendant challenge on the commerce and the kind of competition side in particular. I think it's a little less of a challenge to me on the content side in terms of being able to draw that line. And so, I think for everyone else here, that's the conversation that I think I'm most interested in facilitating. But it would be, kind of, you want to thread it big enough to cover both the offline and the online. So, certainly Sonos is a great example of, market power existing kind of on their platforms, so that is, the App Store would be a great example. I just had to download the new Sonos controller now that they've had to pivot that, there's pieces there, but it's also about the integrations with the Alexa. It's about the distribution and ads. And so kind of how do you draw those circles and those kind of adjacent and kind of sometimes physically separate to digital markets. And so that's where I really think that this discussion can benefit from some articulation on, because I think that is such a challenge to say that, a company that controls your app store delivery, your voice assistant, your online advertising, and also, maybe the shipping infrastructure is kind of a hard thing to get your head around.
Harold, there's some tough definitional questions there that Adam's raising. How do you suggest we attack that?
Right. And this is the classic problem of people know it when they see it, but actually putting it into a description that you could put in a piece of legislation that would then define the role of an agency is a challenge. I've offered one definition in the book and have some statutory language that I would propose that captures that, coming out, as you know, Chris, and now everybody else will know, in our next paper, which expands on some of the concepts that we were talking about there. But I think that we've seen a lot of convergence around several key elements when people talk about this sector. The fact that it's delivered through the internet, which changes the nature of the cost structure and interaction and opens up a global market almost immediately. The enormous network effects that are achieved through these businesses, and they're not just double-sided, but in many cases multi-sided marketplaces, what I call the perfect asymmetry of information, where the platform is the intermediary, because if I order something through Amazon or some other platform, I never know where the problem is. If I'm not, I can't know that there might be better products out there if Amazon doesn't show them to me in its buy window. I don't know if the reason why I'm getting delivery late is because they're not using Amazon's fulfillment center. And similarly, on the vendor side, the vendor is denied the opportunity to form a distinct relationship with me, and that intermediary can shield all the information from there. So everything about one of our most important sectors of the economy now becomes a black box. And when you look at all of these factors together, and what are the underlying elements of the business model that create these factors, that, it seems to me, makes it possible to frame what we're talking about. The other definitional questions that Adam has raised about some of the subject matters that are on platforms, I think are to some degree a little less important if you have a comprehensive regulator, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a comprehensive regulator. We're having a lot of problems with issues in broadband right now because the FCC has taken itself out of the equation without being clear who might be the relevant agency. And for anything that comes up, we now have this: do we go to the FCC, to state enforcement, to the Federal Trade Commission? If you have a comprehensive regulator, you know where to shop. And you don't have to worry nearly as much about these fine points of definition, which also includes, frankly, when something new comes up. There's an example that I love to bring from the FCC's history, which is when we did the 1996 Act and opened long distance markets to competition and local telephone to competition, nobody was worried about the possibility that somebody might change their long distance provider without your permission, because we were so worried about competition, we said, let's make it as easy as possible. And then a new problem came up called slamming, where people were doing this. Now, if we didn't have a regulator that understood how all of this was taking place, we would not have been able to address that problem in a simple and straightforward manner. But in fact, the FCC, because it was a comprehensive regulator, was able to say, oh, okay, we see what the problem is. We have a very simple solution for this. We're going to hold the long distance carriers accountable for what their agents do, so they can't duck behind responsibility. So that, I think, is, once you get the agency right and you make sure that it has an appropriate scope and appropriately well-defined boundaries, the internal definitional issues are something that the agency is suited to work out.
Yeah, and I might just hop in. One thing that I appreciated about Harold's book, and I think your first CPNI paper, was this idea of using principles. So one thing that, as I mentioned at the top, we want to avoid is what we perceive as a harm occurring, but not enough sort of ethical grounding in terms of providing equity to the people who might come to the agency. So one example might be, just to keep it present, with COVID-19. Amazon's response to sort of prioritize essential goods. I think everyone would agree that it's a pandemic, a moment of national crisis, and great that a company would step it up in that scale. But there are a lot of people and businesses, small businesses, that were impacted by that decision, and medium-sized businesses like Sonos, so to be able to, for the regulator to be able to pose a question like that and say, this is a sort of unilateral decision by a company with extraordinary market power in the interest of public health, but it had all these downstream effects, to not get tangled up in just regulations or precedent, but to be able to keep their eye on the ball and be able to pose that question and address something like that swiftly and efficiently, whichever way the regulator would decide. So I think that notion of principles kind of at the top, I think can be very helpful as we imagine what a regulator might look like.
Thanks, Deshi, for adding in, because as someone who made his living mostly as a lobbyist, certainly we talk about the ability for Congress to move at the speed of technology, and having an expert at the FCC at least gave us somewhere to turn, where someone was keeping up with the changes in technology. I think that's absolutely right. Susan, let me turn to you real quickly, because you've been involved with these transatlantic conversations, and I'm curious what are the differences you see between what the conversation looks like here in the U.S. versus, say, in Europe or the U.K. What's happening across the Atlantic, and are they matching up? How are they different?
It's been interesting. The trend is heading in a similar direction, but you have a lot of activity going on at the EU. The Commission just published its basically putting out for public comment, essentially, a host of questions and themes, and it expects to be able to complete a Digital Services Act package by year end. And that package is still at this point amorphous, but has a number of different pieces in it. It does address, for example, the gatekeepers, the major platforms, and has a whole series of questions and issues that it wants to address in that category that would either expand upon the existing competition regulators authorities, or potentially could include an additional European-based or EU-based regulator for that purpose. It also has another separate package of proposals deepening the internal market for digital services, which would address oversight of the digital services, including e-commerce directive, which is similar to our Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It would also is heading in the direction of regulating transparency and accountability. Again, in the notion of looking at what platforms are promising in their terms of service and then holding them accountable to that. They talk about an effective governance system, which could be new or expanded oversight, not necessarily involving authority over competition policy. So they're looking at a number of different things that they can do. This is, again, the EU. Some members of parliament have proposed a more omnibus regulatory authority. So that is also in conversation in Europe. In Great Britain, they issued last year an online digital harms white paper that would address all kinds of harms. I think they cited 23 different types of harms, both illegal speech as well as legal but odious speech. It received a lot of pushback by the human rights community. And this February, they responded with a response to public comments by clearly dividing between the two categories of legal but harmful speech, which they sort of set aside on a regulatory basis, and then illegal speech. They emphasize, again, heading in the same direction, transparency and accountability. It will propose legislation by year end. It includes a duty of care with the platforms deciding what terms of service are appropriate for their communities, and then they have to be enforced consistently and transparently. Ofcom is likely to be the regulator of choice, right now at least, for the UK. It is unlikely to be asked to regulate other areas because they fall within the jurisdiction of other UK regulators. So that's unlikely to happen. But it is looking to bring about greater coordination and consistency across the different online regulatory entities. So there's an awful lot of movement, and it seems to be coming together much more on the transparency and accountability side of the coin.
Okay. And just a reminder, folks, we've got about 20 minutes or so left, so please feel free to throw questions in, and we're happy to get to them. But I want to ask maybe Harold, and then everyone else react. But certainly in your writing and some of the work we've been doing at Public Knowledge, we've been elevating two specific types of regulations that we think would be necessary. One is the importance of interoperability between services online to promote user choices in competition, as well as a concept of non-discrimination for platforms, which we're always careful to note is different than, say, what people think of as like net neutrality for infrastructure and broadband networks. So can you talk a bit about why those two might be important and how a regulator might deal with them?
Well, yes, interoperability is one of these things that we have seen works enormously well in promoting competition. And this has been true across a wide range of markets and technologies, particularly where you either have a specific bottleneck and then you are allowing competitors to access that bottleneck facility through some recognized and standard interface with which the party that controls that bottleneck can't interfere in any way, or alternatively, where you are trying to overcome network effects by making it possible for a new entrant to access all of the customers that are potentially in the market, rather than starting with 0 customers and the other party has all the customers, which makes it practically impossible to challenge the market. So interoperability is one of the first things that competition experts look at as a potential solution. It allows the different types of competition to emerge and allows them to emerge organically. So that's why that comes up quite frequently and why we have pushed it very hard. The non-discrimination, we rather prefer to call it no self-preferencing, meaning that, when you have search functions and recommendation functions, which are one of the features of digital platforms constantly, to some degree, they have to discriminate in terms of making choices in order to function properly. And they have to, and I, as a user, while I may want to set what level of personal information I share with them and what I'm comfortable with and how that information is shared with others, but I want the search engine or the recommendation feature to be responsive to me. I want to not waste my time with lots and lots of results that I find irrelevant, and I value when the results that come up are relevant. But this also introduces enormous opportunity for the platform to manipulate things without knowledge. That's where, as I say, that perfect information asymmetry comes in. And unlike, say, a conventional supermarket or department store where, okay, if it's on the shelf, I can see it. Maybe you put your own house brand up at eye level and you put the rival product, 2 shelves down where it's less convenient. But at least when I'm coming up to the, spices section or whatever, I can see everything that's displayed. If I'm shopping through a digital experience, I can only see what's in the buy window or what the results are of the search engine, and realistically only the first screen results of the search engine. So the situation here is very different. The opportunities for manipulation and self-preferencing are both prevalent and difficult to detect, and therefore having a rule that prohibits self-preferencing is one of the things that becomes critically important in preserving and promoting competition.
And can I just hop in there? The view from our perspective as a company, there might be an assumption that when there are business partners with the dominant platforms that are dealing with this information asymmetry, that we have more insight and access, and we certainly do get access to certain tools that will allow us to better understand how people are buying our products or the sales volume and things like that. But there's a tremendous amount of uncertain. We don't know either. A lot of the times we do have a good sense of what can push us to the top in certain results, whether we're talking about Google or Amazon. But there's a lot of stuff that we just don't know. And when it comes to some of our products, like our working with voice assistants in our products, we know even less. So it's I think there might be an assumption that what the consumer of course wouldn't know what a company or a business partner with one of these larger platforms does know. We do know a little bit more, but we don't know a lot, and that point is very much relevant to even business partners.
And I just want to point out one other thing is the company doesn't even have to be engaged in the bad activity for the fear of it to have an effect. So to take a couple of common examples, there are a lot of people who believe that you will get better placement in Google search if you buy advertising from them using Google AdSense, and that the more advertising you buy, the more they'll subtly push you up. Google consistently denies this. This is one of those things that there doesn't seem to be significant evidence to support, but the fact that people believe it makes it much harder for a potential competitor to emerge, because the potential customers for that advertising competitor think that they're sacrificing their search engine placement by going to the rival. Or even if Google's not doing it today, if Google started to feel threatened, they might do it in the future. So I'll avoid going to a potential rival. So one of the important things about having anti-discrimination rules in place is you don't have to have the lengthy process of a antitrust suit to show that there was a discrimination, to show that there was consumer harm, and all of these other factors that even in the best case will take years to reach a remedy. With a rule, the question is, okay, did you break the rule? And do we have somebody who's able to check under the hood to make sure you're complying with the rule? And it gives tremendous certainty in the marketplace and to the platforms as well, because they know what they can do and what they shouldn't do.
Can I ask, so just one quick, when you say check under the hood, because we've talked about transparency quite a bit, are you talking about the regulator having, say, software engineers who would have the ability to actually look at an algorithm and see whether there's preferencing? I mean, this is to Adam's point earlier. There needs to be a super high level of technical knowledge for that transparency to mean anything.
Oh, absolutely. And I discussed this in the book, what I call the concept of black box testing, because the platform has a legitimate interest in preserving its proprietary information about how its code works, and to keep rivals from harassing with frivolous requests, or to risk having that get out. At the same time, we need transparency and certainty. So an approach is to have a government agency with the appropriate expertise that is capable of saying, okay, we're going to look at the code, and we will determine if there is something here that warrants investigation or not. And because we are the neutral expert agency, we can do this without risking the proprietary information. Now, because agencies can be subject to political capture, you do want to have private rights of action and other things that serve as a backup. But for most of these cases, we would hope in the first instance that this provides the necessary compromise between protecting the legitimate interests of the platform and the legitimate interests of the competitors.
Adam,
I think just.
I know Adam wanted
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
So,
I mean, I think I would flag two things. I think the transparency piece is important in a lot of ways. Obviously, the expertise that Harold has mentioned. I think actually in the report that Susan put out, or Susan put out about the 3 levels of disclosure and transparency, I think that's a really strong framework. There is a public asymmetry, there is an academic and research asymmetry, and then there is a regulator asymmetry. And I think one of the unique positions that House Antitrust is in is that unlike some of our traditional investigators who are constrained about what they may be able to release publicly or not, they or the state's attorney general might have different rules and plans. So I think there is that need for the data asymmetry is so foundational to all of these problems. So I think the different levels of both expertise and disclosure and access are really going to be critical there. I think the other thing I would just add on the great work that Public Knowledge has done on interoperability is really, there's 2 kinds of interoperability issues. There is technical interoperability, and then there's kind of legal and practical interoperability. And so I think, from a technical interoperability point, a lot of what, for instance, I think Sonos is a good example. They are looking to be a place that for the consumer, I could pull in any number of services. And a lot of these software packages, you are certainly allowed to be able to program them to function with multiple voice assistants, but it's often the legal terms that may prohibit there being more than one active voice assistant within there, or there are other conditions for most favored nation or other pieces like that. So I think there is a technical side, and we shouldn't underestimate the technical challenge of, say, retrofitting interoperability onto maybe previously existing networks that have been built, but it's not impossible. But there's also the legal side, and I think Amazon is probably the most interesting example in this, in that based on Bezos's decision 15 years ago to build open APIs for all of their products, so that the company which runs Amazon.com on AWS uses the same service that Public Knowledge might, and same APIs Public Knowledge might to run their website. But it is the legal most favored nation and some of the restrictions and clauses there that prevent kind of truer interoperability for this. So it really requires both of those expertise. And I think both of them are tremendous challenges, but they are really interlinked, and some places have that in a different way than other companies do.
Thank you, Adam. We've got about 5 minutes left. I do want to turn to at least one question here from the audience. And there's an interesting one here that kind of is where I wanted to take the conversation anyway, because Susan, you were talking about the conversations in Europe. They seem to be a bit ahead of us in trying to set up a regulator. This question from the audience says, what are the necessary political conditions for the US Congress to advance a framework like the one we've been discussing? What would it take to meet these conditions? And they even suggested, would it take some sort of crisis in the marketplace? There's a question of, do we already have some emergencies or crises in the marketplace? So let's open that up to the panel. I think Deji agrees that there's some concern in the marketplace. I don't know if you want to go first, but others, what political conditions do we need to move forward with a regulator?
Well, yeah. Oh, sorry. Did you say Susan go first?
Oh, well, Deji and then Susan.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think we've made this clear publicly that we think now is the time to intervene. That at least in our market, the way that dominant platforms have kind of plunged in will leave an impact for 15 years. There's never a perfect time, but now would be a good time to start. But I did want to say that I do like that Public Knowledge has advanced, a phased approach where a regulator is one solution, but there's lots of steps along the way. And I think we're fully supportive of that too.
Thanks. Susan?
After November, I do not think it's healthy for us to be talking about, not us, but to have these debates about legislation. They at the moment, during a very heated electoral campaign, the bullying that was associated with the executive order that came out, the direction of regulating to what I call tilt the playing field rather than leveling the playing field. Again, everything today is seen through the lens of the November elections. I think it's extraordinarily important for everyone to be having these conversations because there's an awful lot that we need to understand. We need to get the platforms to be more forthcoming with a lot more information to work together to try to come up with solutions, some of which they are doing, and a lot more needs to be done. So I think the timing is good to have those conversations, but it's also good timing to participate in some of the debate in Europe because they are moving ahead very on a track that's quite rapid, with the expectation that they will have a comprehensive set of legislation in the fall, both in Europe and in the UK. So to the extent that US and Canada can play in those conversations so that we can have a more coordinated set of rules, I think that would be to the benefit of the public as well as the marketplace.
And I would just say, I think there's two things. I think one is that the people who are, I think, as Harold talked a little bit earlier, we kind of know it when we see it. We certainly feel that many people feel there's a problem. I think the kind of work that House Antitrust has been doing and the reports they're going to release will help illuminate some of this information asymmetry we've stuck with. So I think will provide us all with more examples. And I think that acceleration we're seeing of COVID-19, of small businesses being disproportionately affected, of shuttered streets, of shuttered storefronts and things like that, both of those are going to be kind of catalyst outside of the election, I think, to start, kind of getting the arms around the problem. And I think the third is what Susan has said, which is, having seen Europe and others take the lead on these issues, for instance, I think tease up if there were a new administration, for instance, they might be interested in assuming a leadership role that we have essentially thrown the mantle off of, with the exception of anything that maybe personally insults the president online. So I think that, there is an opportunity there that kind of strikes at the possibility, not just politically, but also kind of in the moment that what we see with our own eyes.
It's interesting, Harold, and then I'll want you to answer because we're getting close to the end here. But, Susan mentioned the executive order that came out from the White House. Some folks might feel like we're picking on some of the larger tech companies here and calling for some regulations. But from my understanding, a lot of us who were concerned about that executive order and where it took a turn for government regulation of speech, that the large tech companies are pretty much in agreement that that's a bad idea, that we want to encourage them to moderate content, that we want to encourage users to have choice in the marketplace. And so, curious kind of your take on, where there's regulation that, or there are regulations that encourage users and empower users to make choices, how that fits with some of the things that platforms are already defending when it comes to free speech.
Yeah, I'm just, I guess, a couple of points. One of the important things about putting authority in the regulatory context, I mean, since people would look at the Trump administration and say, oh, well, see, this is what happens when you start to regulate. I'm like, no, the reason why the Trump administration has been able to do what it's been able to do with all of its, bullying and selective prosecution has been precisely because it isn't subject to a clear statutory rule and an agency bounded by the Administrative Procedure Act. There's a reason why the FCC isn't going to do anything quickly, even if they get a petition from NTIA on Attorney General Barr can, threaten to do all kinds of things and, come out with all kinds of recommendations because they're not bound by the Administrative Procedure Act. And they're not limited by the language of the statute limiting their jurisdiction. The other point relevant to your question is, yeah, I mean, we need to understand that a lot of times regulation is about giving a push or enabling companies to take some risks in this area with the knowledge of, they're clearly permitted to do something, or there's clearly going to be a referee that's going to be able to sort these things out. Facebook has repeatedly said, look, it's not our job to know what the right rules are political advertising are. You, government whose job it is, should tell us what are the specific rules, not we like this guy and not this guy, but you want us to require disclosure. Okay, tell us to require disclosure. You want us to evaluate for accuracy of information. Okay, tell us to do that, but for God's sake, please don't leave it to us, because everybody will hate what we do. And frankly, we shouldn't be outsourcing democracy like this. We want to take steps to encourage companies and say, yeah, you have the freedom to pull things down if you think they're going to be offensive. You have the freedom to experiment within limits, how you're going to manage your news feeds and so forth. The government reserves the right to deal with harmful content and things that are proven to cause either to cause harm and real harm, not insulting the president kind of harm. But at the end of the day, what we want is to find this appropriate balance where the government is not involved in the specifics of the content itself, but is creating the environment in which there are opportunities for people to engage with one another, to find the news and information that makes democracy possible, and avoid the kinds of hacks to the system that we have seen where unethical and ruthless parties are able to engineer things up to and including genocide by taking advantage of the weaknesses of these tools.
Yeah. So there's a lot there, and I wish we had another hour to go, you guys, because I think what's evident from this conversation, there's a lot of things that could be involved with a digital regulator, from content moderation to promoting competition in a lot of different ways. We didn't even get to, there was a question that just popped up we won't get to around ads, fake ads, but it just shows, and fraud, but it just shows there's more that we can do to discuss this and to popularize this idea so we can catch up to the conversation with the rest of the world. So thank you guys for being our expert panel today. As I said, we'll follow up as we usually do with these webinars with materials from our panelists that you can check out. And we hope you'll go to publicknowledge.org to learn more about these concepts of having a digital regulator so that we can promote consumer choice and competition in the marketplace in the future. So thank you guys for coming. And before we go, how do folks reach you guys online? Susan Ness, are you on Twitter or anything you can promote? No?
No, but the Annenberg Public Policy Center is.
All right. So you can find Susan online at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, University of Pennsylvania. Adam?
I am online. Follow me at your own risk. There's a lot of takes that aren't solely tech policy related. So, but I promise to be on my best behavior.
Okay. Adam's a Renaissance man. I know Deji is as well.
Yeah. So yeah, you might hear a little bit of policy, but it might be a little bit of science fiction as well. And it's at Olutron, Olutron, on Twitter.
Okay. And Harold, where do you like to be followed best? Your blog, your Twitter?
Well, I have been most active recently on Twitter, which is Harold Feld, and but you can also see my lengthier and somewhat snarkier writings at Tales of the Sausage Factory, which is hosted at wetmachine.com.
A very popular tech blog. I encourage folks to check it out. And you can find me on Twitter at ChrisJ_Lewis. Please follow Public Knowledge on Twitter as well. You'll hear about future webinars there. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next webinar.